So welcome to this morning's discussion, when the defense of democracy becomes a crime and the defenders become criminals. My name is Kristina Henschen, and with me today, I'm from the trade union solidarity organization Union to Union. And with me today, I have the Belarus writer Viktor Martinovitj.
Hello.
I have Pomerantsev, British writer with a Russian-Ukrainian background. And I have Anna-Lena Laurén, correspondent in Moscow for Dagens Nyheter. And I also want to tell the audience that if Anna-Lena ran off the stage, it's not a protest against all of us. It's because she's so busy and she has to catch a flight. And it will happen.
Let's hope for the best. Running away.
So welcome to all of you as well. And so what we see here in the latest years is that human rights organizations, democracy activists, and wider civil society movements, as well as journalists and writers, of course, in many countries are facing increased restrictions when carrying out their work. This process has been so established in the development cooperation, at least, so we even have our own expression about this. We call it a shrinking civic space that is going on. And what we see is that this pushback is global. The trend seems to be lasting. The golden years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the window of opportunity is closing, and the response is totally inadequate. According to the Carnegie and the Guardian, over the past years, more than 60 countries have passed or drafted laws that curtail the activity of non-governmental organizations, and 96 countries have taken steps to enable non-governmental organizations from operating at full capacity. And it's even said to be like a viral-like spread of new laws. Let me start with you, Viktor. You are from Belarus, a very repressive environment, very close to us, and it has been called as one of the dictatorships in Europe. What is your own experience of this shrinking space? Because after all, you're from an environment where the space has been shrinking for so long.
Well, I have the feeling that in our part of the world, in all these post-Soviet countries, the shrinking started in the 20th of the 20th century, and it's unendless. With small pause in perestroika times, we have the same story all over again, all over, from the Lenin's times. So I don't want to be boring and telling a story about repressions or whatever. You can easily get it on internet if you're interested. I will tell you a funny story concerning my novel, which has the title of Många. It's the novel. Mova is language in Belarusian. Since we have two languages, we are enshadowed by Russian culture. Russian language, as Ukrainians do. And we have our native language, Belarusian, and 5 years ago it was very easy to get caught and get to jail because of using this Belarusian language, so I decided to revise this story into a novel, into the science fiction novel. So the set is in the far future, and there is no trace of Belarus anymore. We are part of Russia, Minsk is Russian city, and blah, blah, blah. And the people are selling the beautiful examples of Belarusian 19th and 18th century literature as they would sell the drugs. And there is an anti-drug police who are hunting them. So this is a set, yeah. And actually the drug users are using this mova, this language, this poetry to get higher, and somehow it works. But the story happened 3 years ago when we presented this novel in the small city of Grodno. We came out of capital city. In capital was okay. So we went to Grodno, and 2 hours before the presentation, the state regional library in which we're supposed to make the event cancelled the event. and we had an enormous amount of readers in the benches, in the staircase of this library, and they simply wanted me to appear and to do something. And then it was a local Greek Catholic priest, the priest, who was also, I mean, he's Belarusian spoken, and he wanted to do something for the novel. So he took the crowd and he transferred all of us to the church, to the Greek Catholic Church. And I had Jesus Christ and Maria in my back. And it was very unique. But it's only the beginning of the story, because 10 minutes after we started, KGB and Men in Black and cameramen from police appeared. And they were headed by the fire department. And they put the official blames of making the literary presentation in the place which is not equipped for the literary presentations. And they closed the church. The fire department closed the church permanently. Can you imagine that? And luckily I was accompanied by my publisher, who asked, he told that writer is not guilty. I was invited him to Grodno, so put my name in the protocol. So it was my publisher who was invited to the court, luckily. And he received a fine. Hopefully they didn't put him in jail for that. He received a fine, and we shared it, we split it on 2 parts.
Thank you, Viktor. Very interesting example and very tragic, of course. But what are your comments, Peter and Anna-Lena, when you hear this on a concrete example, when even a church is not equipped for meetings, reading a novel, or discussing literature?
Well, actually it made me think of Pussy Riot, surprisingly, because they had their performance also in a church. And it's also, in a way, it's a very good example on how, actually, to be honest, it makes me a bit optimistic, the way there are so many different institutions who are still working together in order to protect freedom of speech, or the Belarusian language, such as priests, for example, who are making their churches sanctuaries. So, in a way, what I was thinking when talking about the shrinking civic space, I started working in Russia in 2006, and ever since there has been talk about the shrinking civic space, which is a fact. It's shrinking all the time. But in some strange way, it still survives somehow. I'm talking about Russia now. In Belarus, the situation is worse. In Russia, it's not good, but there are still platforms, and I'm not saying so everything's fine. There are platforms. Everything is not fine at all, but I'm just very often extremely impressed by these people who are all the time able to find new platforms to carry on the discussion, to carry on the debate. It's really amazing. It's unbelievable how these things still are surviving.
And these are people, I guess, you try to cover in your reporting.
Yeah.
In your excellent reporting. What about you, Peter? You are you even wrote a whole book about the development in Russia, and it ends up in a quite a negative way, where we have the case of Sergei Magnitsky, we have Bill Browder, we have actually the defenders of democracy becoming accused themselves for corruption and for very, very bad things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a story that Putin likes to tell. I don't know if it's true, but he likes to tell it. How in the 1970s or early 80s, when he was running a department of the KGB in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, some dissidents were about to make a press conference with the Western press about human rights abuses, And he likes to tell the story about how he was cleverer than them. He didn't try to arrest them, because that would have made the Western press write about them. He arranged a fake human rights event half an hour before, and put out letters to all the Western press saying, come to this thing. And they had this fake event before, which told some bullshit, and the press came, wrote about it, and left. So when the real dissidents came, nobody was listening to them. So that's one of the, since they've come into power, that's one of the ways they play this. In Soviet times, there was an excitement about freedom of expression. It was sexy and cool, and human rights activists were almost like rock stars. Now what Putin has done, I mean, often he arrests them, and Belarus is much worse, but usually he just makes them irrelevant by creating his own human rights organizations, who are fake human rights organizations. Edward Snowden's lawyer, for example, Kucherena, is a very famous example. So it's interesting how they play it now. They don't want to make it into an issue. They kind of dissolve it by creating their own pseudo.
But at the same time, it's interesting because there is this Human Rights Council, the president's own Human Rights Council, and there are some very decent people there, by the way. Ludmila Alexeyeva. Ella Pavlova is not decent anymore, she used to be decent, but there are other people there who really are talking about the real problems, and some of them have told me that, and also very interestingly, Andrei Zubov, the professor who got kicked out of the Russian diplomatic school after he had criticized the annexation of Crimea, is also, at least used to be member of one of the own presidentials, these kind of structures. And I asked him why last year. He said, because this is not Nazi Germany. If that was the case, we would all be dead, Anna-Lena. But they are, well, I'm not trying to belittle what Putin is doing, but there is what you're talking about is this very strange game where there are structures and institutions where they sometimes actually talk to the very people who are criticizing them, not fake people, but really the real human rights activists. And then they just carry on doing the same things all over again.
That's the thing, yeah. They've, and the conversation is pointless. So people come, they go blah blah. People go, really, how interesting.
Yes, but some of these human rights activists have told me that it's still important that they have this council because it's some sort of channel. But of course, Memorial people, for example, have told me this. That they still think it's a good. They don't want it to. They understand what it's all about, but they are still using it, trying to influence somehow. And interestingly, Memorial in St. Petersburg, as you know, probably got closed down last year because it was classed as a foreign agent. But in the same year, Memorial in Moscow got a presidential grant. I think it was 6 million rubles or something.
So even if it's fake, they see a value of the fake organization. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, but it's a sort of game. With the one hand, they're putting everything down, and with the other hand, they are in a way, they get, with the left hand, they are classing Memorial as a foreign agent, and with the other one, they are giving them a presidential grant. So it's a kind of, I get the impression that they want some sort of Memorial and Echa Moskvi. They want them to exist, but they have to be controlled. So they have to be kept scared all the time, but they still have to exist somehow.
I mean, this is very interesting also in the case of Belarus. You have like two writers' unions, you have like a double set of organizations for human rights work and freedom of expression, right?
Yes, yeah.
It's very institutionalized, I mean.
They very good at hiding. I mean, at producing the copies and splitting. Because the union of writers is not the case because they really put it into two, and a lot of organizations were just split on the pro-governmental and anti-governmental, which is very weak. I mean, writers should not be involved in politics. We are about good literature. We shouldn't pose ourselves towards government. We don't care about government. We should just concentrate on literature and letters. But not, it doesn't work like that.
That's the message from the official union of writers.
We have to make a choice whether we are traitors or we are patriots. And I think that both choices are disgusting. I don't want to be participated in any official union, and I'm a member of unofficial union. And the moment when politics come to literature, it's a moment when a good literature usually dies, because literature is deeper than politics, usually. I believe in that.
Do you think Putin was taking the Belarus example as a model. Or is it how? What is your analysis? What happened actually?
Well, I think, as we all know, Putin doesn't like Lukashenko at all, and he knows Lukashenko is very shrewd, and he's not an easy partner to deal with, and there are many people in Russia who envy the Belarusians. I think that they go to Belarus and things like roads are good, and cities are clean, and everything is in order, and the colhoses are working, and I've been told many times that people like to have other things arranged the same way as in Belarus. So, and of course Putin sees Lukashenko as on a lot lower level than himself, so it's not possible for Putin to start to do things like Lukashenko, but not only because of his personal esteem, it's also of course the fact that he's president of Russia, which is imperial, a big country, powerful, and he's not taking models of Lukashenko, but still, it's very interesting to see how these things in a way go hand in hand, because the same authoritarian system which you have in Russia is present in Belarus, but in Belarus it's so much harsher, and it's even, obviously it's easier in a small country to make it this harsh.
It's because we are older. We started at 1994. Our counter-revolution happened in 1994, while in Russia it happened in 1999.
And why do you think, Peter? Why does Putin or Lukashenko want to control writers in this way? What's the dangerous movement here in literature? Why is it a threat?
I don't know about Lukashenko because that's such a unique story, but Putin is part of a neo-authoritarian wave that we see in China and Turkey, in Hungary now, so inside the EU, Orban, in Latin America. So this is a whole wave of dictators 2.0, and they're not going to make the stupid mistakes their predecessors did. Their predecessors created, by being totalitarian in their ideology, they created a real opposition, real dissidents who are cool and sexy. Now they're going to be much subtler. They're going to try to own, control, and spin the opposition. They're going to allow a little bit of freedom, and then put big ring fences around it. The Chinese do the same thing. Ai Weiwei is put in prison sometimes, but is usually let out. So they're very aware that the stupidest thing you can do is be a totalitarian. Totalitarianism is for losers. They're much, much cleverer, and they're flourishing. So they're probably right.
What do you say, Anna-Lena? How should we actually understand how the disinformation is used right now in Russia and maybe also in Belarus?
You talk about the disinformation of the propaganda machine, or this whole system of protecting and at the same time destroying. Well, when it comes to the propaganda machine, I'm talking about Russian state TV, I think it's all very clear. And unfortunately, because I'm a correspondent, I have to watch it. And it's becoming extremely boring right now, because it's the same message being touted out all over and over again. But when it comes to human rights organizations, I think it remains very important for the West to support these, especially these old Russian traditional human rights organizations, such as Memorial, for example, or Levada Center, which is not a human rights organization, it's a sociological research institute, which has now been classed as a foreign agent. The problem is, of course, that you cannot, by giving money to these organizations, you're not helping them. They can't take money because they're classed as foreign agents. But it's very, very important to continuously keep up these issues and talk about them with Russian leaders, or just keep them on the agenda, because Putin, on the one hand, he loves to show off that he doesn't care at all about his reputation in the West, but he actually is, I think, more interested in what people are saying about him in the West than he pretends. So it's been shown many times that there have been organizations, that there have been medias which have been very much under threat, and at the very last moment they are saved somehow. Of course, it's not because we are talking about them in the West, but it's still can always help. And the worst thing which can happen is to forget about them, not to talk about them.
Is that a strategy that would work, do you think, Viktor?
I'm not sure that it will work. I think the meaning of what Peter said is that we have kind of new type of suppression, new type of dictatorship. Dictatorship 2.0, meaning dictatorship enrolled and involved in medias. So we have something like mediocracy, media which does everything that used to be done to the bodies, to the brains. They they capture the brains, not bodies, and it worked in Italy with Berlusconi, who was first to use this system. And I think it will work in Russia and in Belarus. It works in Belarus. The first thing that was done to the media in Belarus was the re-privatization of the channels. Now we have all TV channels owned by the state. And they had very similar situation in France with Sarkozy, who didn't control the state. The television wasn't state-owned. But he controlled the television through some channels, through some tools. And it's always effective, because when you have a totalitarian type of charismatic leader plus big media, that's a system you can't break with street protests or whatever. But what we have now in Belarus is some kind of new page of what is happening, because the story about power and suppression is boring, and we have some kind of story of renaissance of those who are opposing power, and they invited a new way, and this way is not the street protests and not the political involvement, which is useless. What we do, and I'm a part of this big movement, is working with culture. Since the Putin are so powerful, is that they apply to the dead souls of Soviet people which are enrooted in our minds. And if you cut these connections between contemporary Russians and contemporary Belarusians, this connection of them to these dead souls of Soviets, who we once were. I was a member of pioneer organization once in my childhood, and I was wearing the Lenin sign on my jacket. So if we cut the connection, you will have very different people. You will have very different. What we see it in Ukraine right now. They have this renaissance not because of the natural processes, but because of opposing the war with Russia. So they decided to put more attention to culture, to language, to identity, to the different history what we used to have. And I think that will drive us to success somehow.
This is very interesting, a new way of working, but can it be also dangerous? I'm thinking, culture is and the renaissance of identity and is very close to nationalism. What do you say, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a very Soviet idea to fight with the idea of a Soviet mentality. It's a very communist idea, the idea of people had the wrong mentality. And I see that sadly in Ukraine. This Bolshevik idea to be anti-Bolshevik. There was a phrase the Soviets had, proshloye люди, people of the past. So what I see sadly in Ukraine is not a flourishing of new identity, but a kind of Bolshevik, communist, totalitarian idea dressed up as nationalism. And I deeply don't believe in the idea of a Soviet mentality. I think the Soviet Union lasted 70 years, incredibly complex and mixed cultural sphere. Within it, it has the ingredients of freedom, and within it has also the ingredients of authoritarianism. Sadly, what I see in Ukraine is a new communism dressed up as nationalism. Nothing is bad. I mean, you can't compare it qualitatively. There's no complex. But the mentality, the ideas are of course deeply Soviet, and sadly, I don't see a renaissance in Ukraine. I see a slipping away into rubbish.
Well, actually, unfortunately, I have to agree with you on this one. And on the one hand, I understand what Professor Viktor's talking about. I understand it very well, and in a way it's logical, because trying to form a new identity on your own language and your culture, it's something which can bring people together and make them proud of who they are, which is a very nice thing. But in Ukraine, which I'm following a lot also, I also feel that there is this really, as the Soviet idea that you just tell people to be Ukrainians, talk Ukrainian, and then we will have a democracy. It doesn't work that way. And one very good example was during actually the Maidan revolution. I was there, I don't remember how many times, and afterwards there was this Ukrainian Inform Center which was formed at the Hotel Ukraine, and they were handing out leaflets and all sorts of materials. And one leaflet was for journalists who are ignorant about Ukrainian history and how Ukraine works, so we were giving leaflets so we would learn. And then there was Eastern Ukraine, usually Eastern Ukrainers, and a guy in some sort of miner's dress. Workers, usually low education, usually don't speak English, usually have never been abroad, Soviet-minded. Western Ukrainians, Vyshivanka, this Ukrainian shirt, open-minded, broadly minded, have traveled, speak English, support the EU. Soros Foundation was supporting this, excuse me for saying this rubbish. So there really is, I think it's very, and Ukraine is really, I'm not talking about Belarus now, I'm talking about Ukraine, because Ukraine it's a very special case. I think it's very dangerous to start building your new identity on stereotypes. I think it's still important to try to work together and include everyone instead of excluding, especially not building on stereotypes.
How do you handle this?
I should just explain one thing about Ukraine and about Belarus. It's when somebody starts to talk about language or history in Sweden or in Germany, he sounds like a right-winged nationalist. But when we are talking about Belarus, when you have the language of this country enshadowed by Russia, and when you have people arrested for the use of this language, you have not the right-winged, but the left-wing discourse. Because we are not talking about we are talking about equality and equality discourse. We are trying and we are asking for the equal rights for those who are speaking language. And we are asking for the equal rights for those who are talking about history of medieval Europe, not only about the history of World War II, which is a part of Soviet myth about our identity. So it's a left discourse. We are less left, not right.
So you have managed to create your own special context where we cannot apply those stereotypes of nationalists.
I think it was Lukashenko who created this context, and it was Soviet Union which created this context with our culture and Ukrainian culture suppressed and replaced by so-called Soviet culture, which was broadly Russian languaged. And we're just trying to get out of this.
There's always been a tension throughout Eastern Europe and throughout the Soviet Empire between national rights and human rights. And I think Westerners were always very confused by this. So someone like Orban, who's turned out to be a right-winger, was always into national rights. Gamsa-Kurdia, the leader in some ways of the Georgian dissidents who turned out to be a fascist, he was into national rights. And we get confused. We see Ukraine now. I mean, actually, there is a huge group in Ukraine who do understand human rights, but there's also a very powerful one who are just into national rights. And in the West, we just get confused because we just think about it in terms of rights, full stop. And someone like Kaczynski in Poland, was with the dissidents, but he was interested in national rights, which by their nature aren't particularly democratic in the largest space. So I think we've had a lot of confusion between those two movements.
If you go back to those kind of fake organizations that you've been describing as well, and the way of disinforming and trying to confuse us, I know, Peter, you have objected against the expression of information war. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? Because after all, there is some kind of uncontrolled disinformation that is going on. What is your view here?
Yeah, I don't like. I mean, this might not be relevant to Sweden, but inside of in Eastern Europe and in Russia, the information war has become sort of an excuse for failure. So the Kremlin explains its failure in the Cold War not because it had a bad economy or bad rights or it was a bad system, but it was an information war from the West. You know, everything is reduced to an influence operation. So Amnesty International, trade union movements, Jackson Pollock jazz, they have no meaning as such. They are just a weapon. And now they say they have to use it back. So it's very important not to replicate that language, I think. So you have information warfare, the use of information, to subvert, destabilize other countries. That's a part of warfare. And that's a military, conversation to have. Then you have an attack, not an information war, but a war on information. The use of disinformation, conspiracy, fakes to kind of confuse people. But I don't think we can reduce all of society to influence operations. So you have this already. So Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, when there was a bad article about him in the New York Times, said, it's information war. It's like, no, it's just people criticizing you. In Latvia, you have this all the time. Every time there's a problem in the country, they say, it's Russian information warfare. And it's not. It's just, they have a really bad economic policy. So I think we can't start replicating the Kremlin's discourse.
We should be a little bit better than that.
Well, if we want to survive, yeah. Or else we'll end up like them.
And how do you see this disinformation on the ground in Belarus? How does it affect you and the societal discussion?
Well, I think it's interesting that we past 5 minutes were talking about language, whether we should call something informational war or not. So I think the idea of any strong power is to replace whole set of meanings that is used by I don't know, opposition or dissidents by some new words, and then they say, for example, democracy, or they really say that our elections are democracy elections and they're transparent, but they mean something very different by that. And I think our meaning, our mission of writers or those who are in the partisanship, cultural partisanship, is to try to bring back the meanings to the words. And when something is called black, to express, to remind that black is black and white is white, and not vice versa. When you are opposed by television, for example, and big medias who are transponing, who are telling that black is white and white is black, you have to pay a lot of efforts to apply a lot of efforts to make it sound how it should sound. This is a philosophical way to answer the question.
It's very interesting. So the fake is not. It also includes a lot of lying in the disinformation. I mean, you, Peter, you've been writing a lot about this when it comes to the lying, not only in Russia and the lying of the regime there, but also, that when it doesn't matter that you're revealed with saying a lie, it doesn't matter because you just move on and you're not taking responsibility for spreading lies.
Yes, that's exactly what I've written a book about. Yes.
But would you? I know your new project is exploring this culture or irresponsible behavior on a wider dimension from Putin to other movements in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think the point that was made about replacing words with other meanings is really key. No, we see it everywhere. Listen, look, every time there's a technological information revolution in the world, it empowers demagogues and liars. So when the printing press was invented, we always think of it, the Enlightenment happened. No, the first things that were printed en masse were, calls to pogroms against Jews and crazy conspiracy theories. When radio appeared, it empowered Hitler. When television appeared in America, it empowered McCarthy. So technological revolutions usually empower demagogues and liars, and it takes quite a long time for society to set up rules and behavioral codes to deal with that. We have that again. We have an information revolution, and it's empowered ISIS, Putin, the narco gangs in Mexico who have an incredible propaganda operation, and Donald Trump. So, we're in for a very rough ride.
And how can we actually go forward in this to reclaim the real meaning of the words, Viktor? How can we fight this war, or this? How can we play this game to our advantage?
We don't have an access to. I'm not on TV. Peter was on TV and he had his chance, but I'm not on TV. I'm in a blacklist, and being blacklisted cultural, cultural actor, meaning to search for another more slow ways to the public. And literature is one of these ways, and it's extremely slow. We cover hundreds of thousands in very slow time. We have to spend 5 years of selling of your book to cover the audience that television or big internet site covers in 2 clicks in 5 minutes. But it changes. I think that literature is much more powerful than they think, because they gave up with literature. By the way, my books are in every state-owned Belarusian shop, and they are selling right now in enormous amounts, because they thought that literature is not dangerous anymore because it's so slow and it can't improve the politics. But I think literature is very interesting too, because it does changes the reader. Website or television doesn't change the inner structure of mind of reader, and literature does. And this is my answer of this question. I try to nurse the new citizens of my country.
But how in practice, how can you in practice do that when you're blacklisted? Is it about collecting a bunch of people having a reading? I'm not invited on TV. So the literature and the books is my only media. But if you wrote the good book, it will be spread like the sparkle. And what we have right now, my 5th novel has been sold, the whole circulation was sold in 2 weeks. And we reprinted it, and it's already gone. And we're talking not about hundreds, but about thousands. So it's working, like in media. So we are mediatize the literature. We empower literature with the powers of media, which is interesting. And I have to add that you're yet not translated to Swedish, but to many other languages.
Oh,
and
yes.
we hope that you will, hopefully after this book fair, somebody will take the opportunity here. But what you're actually saying is also that we need a lot of helpers here. I look at Peter. We need a lot of helpers here in this fight.
Yeah, I very much agree with it. It's very much a case of building myths in a good sense. So take Ukraine. Since the war started in the east of the country, the journalistic community, as it is, and it's not really journalistic, has split. with a lot of people saying we have to be patriotic, we have to lie, we can't say what's really going on in the war because, you know, the job of journalists now is to be like soldiers. And you have members of the government who encourage this, the Interior Minister, and the very few real journalists are like, hold on, but we have to actually criticize the government and say what's really happening in the war, because that's what journalists do. Most people in the country don't understand this idea. They don't understand why would you do that? That's like, you know, you're a traitor. And there is no myth of the journalist inside Ukraine. So in the West, we grew up with this myth. You know, we have films all the time, like, you know, you grew up with All the President's Men, or, this film that won the Oscar last year, Spotlight, about, you know, journalists at the Boston Globe, or a series like Showtime, or NewsHour, the big Aaron Sorkin series. So we grow up with stories about how journalism is important. In Ukraine, people are like, what? Why? And so the real journalists are under attack for being traitors. So it's incredibly important to work with, I mean in a good way, with myths, yeah? Because people just don't understand why on earth you would be that. And that is probably the ground that has to be contested.
But how can we mobilize this movement or this understanding on a more of a global scale? What are the opportunities? Because after all, we are, or in many cases, the world is now watching what is going on, but nobody's really taking an adequate response to this.
Well, no, largely we make it worse. So, look, everything, you know, policy is myth-making as well. So we've been talking about Russian disinformation, yeah? So you watch a Kremlin propagandist on TV, and they're very good, very Goebbels-like. You know, they praise Goebbels a lot, they like Goebbels. And they do these kind of 10 minutes of hate on TV. So they'll be like, you know, kill the gays, you know, attack the Jews, attack the human writers, attack the human rights activists, all traitors. So you have this on Kremlin TV, and then there's an advertising break. Advertising for Volvo, advertising for IKEA. We fund their hate speech, which is on the level of Nuremberg now. We pay for it. We give them the money. And so it's so easy for them to go around and say, your human rights is bullshit. Yeah? What matters is Volvo and IKEA, and we have that money.
How will we put this pressure on the companies that actually advertise and fund this, those hate speeches or this propaganda?
I think that Peter's idea was not to put them in the blacklist, I mean the TV channels, to put them in the blacklist of advertisement, but to, I mean, they're already losing because there are European and American brands on Russian TV in advertisement blocks. It's kind of symbolic loss because the Western goods and commodities are sold better than Russian or Belarusian one. So I'm interpreting Peter.
No, the opposite. I mean the absolute opposite. Basically, in the Cold War, we had this great argument that human right, political freedom, personal freedom, economic freedom were somehow united. That was the great story of the West. That there's some sort of connection between IKEA, Jackson Pollock, Jazz, and Amnesty International. Quite the opposite. What the Chinese, the Russians, new authoritarians have said, you can have your Volvo, you can have your IKEA, you can have your Mercedes, and no human rights. The myth of the West is bullshit. It's quite the opposite. I think it's a huge victory for the Russians. They're not trying to prove that they're better, they're just trying to prove that the West is bullshit. And they've won, essentially. So every time IKEA or Volvo advertise on channels which promote abuses of minorities, hate speech, it undermines the whole project of democracy. And it's a joke, the idea that IKEA is like a gay-friendly company, when it funds channels who encourage violence against gay people.
We have 1 minute left, and I will give this to you, Viktor.
Well,
yes, I also want to ask you, before you respond to this, I want to ask you, what do you want the world to do on the case of Belarus, but also on this global trend? What can the world do better to change the situation?
I think Nobel Prize for Orkhan Pamuk improved political situation in Turkey at the moment of receiving of this prize, better than any political instrument. So please publish Russian writers, please publish Belarusian writers, please pay some attention to our culture, and this will improve the situation in our countries, because the writers and their words and their literature and their culture, their messages will be received properly. This is my line.
Thank you, Viktor Martinovitj, writer from Belarus, and Peter Pomerantsev, with your experience also from Russia, with your book, Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. A big hand for you and Anna-Lena, who managed to fly away, and for the audience that came here to listen to this discussion.